Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a wild piece of business history where a massive macroeconomic crisis literally crashed right into the living rooms of millions of families. We are talking about a perfect storm of technological shifts, fierce supply chain battles, and global economics that completely ruined the holiday season for kids everywhere. Yep, we're diving into the great 1988 chip crisis. Picture this. It's Christmas morning, 1988. You've been crossing the days off your calendar for months, right? You're dreaming of unwrapping that beautiful, shiny gold Legend of Zelda cartridge, or maybe finally getting your hands on Punch-Out. But then you tear off the wrapping paper and there's nothing. Just empty boxes. Your parents actually have to sit you down and break the news that every single toy store in a 50-mile radius was completely sold out. And this wasn't just a case of a popular choice selling really well. This was a global crisis that brought the entire video game industry to its knees.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand the sheer heartbreak of those empty toy store shelves, we really need to pull back the curtain and look at the massive macroeconomics at play. What exactly ruined Christmas in 1988? Well, it definitely wasn't poor planning by parents, and it wasn't a lack of ideas from game developers either. To figure out what really happened, we first have to understand just how gigantic the main player in this story had become.
If you lived through the late 1980s, you already know Nintendo wasn't just a brand, it was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. By 1988, Nintendo of America was raking in an astounding $1.7 billion in revenue, and they controlled a staggering 80% of the entire video game market. Honestly, for a kid between the ages of 8 and 15, not having an NES was practically like not having a baseball bat. It was just everywhere. But right as this Nintendo Mania was hitting an absolute boiling point, the company slammed into a massive brick wall that threatened to derail their whole empire. Now here's where we get a classic bait and switch. You'd normally expect that Nintendo was fighting off other consoles for factory resources, right? You'd think their biggest headaches were the Sega Master System or the Atari 7800. Nope. The real threat, the actual villains in this story, were the newest high-tech must-haves of the late 80s, camcorders and portable telephones. These new gadgets were selling like hotcakes, and that brings us to the core issue, a severe semiconductor drought. See, the world was rapidly moving toward a new generation of semiconductor technology. The catch? Manufacturers simply couldn't build factories fast enough to keep up. Switching production lines from older chips to newer, more advanced ones is an incredibly complex, time-consuming process that requires retooling entire facilities. And during this awkward transition period, those hot new camcorders and portable phones used the exact same older memory chips required to build Nintendo cartridges. Suddenly, Mario wasn't just competing with Sonic or Pac-Man. He was caught in a global supply chain war with the massive telecommunications industry. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute financial nightmare Nintendo was facing. Because demand was higher than ever in human history, prices for these vital components skyrocketed pretty much overnight. A standard memory chip that cost about $2 in 1987 suddenly jumped between $10 and $12 by 1988. When you're a company manufacturing millions upon millions of cartridges, a five-fold increase in parts costs is absolutely catastrophic to your bottom line. Nintendo was bleeding from these rising costs, and to survive the impending holiday season, they had to execute a desperate triage strategy. Step 1. They made the shocking decision to completely discontinue a dozen of their smaller games right at the peak of Mario Mania. Step 2. They took whatever limited chip supply was freed up by those cancellations. And Step 3. They funneled absolutely everything into their heavy hitters. They were literally sacrificing their own library of games just to make sure copies of Super Mario Bros. And Zelda stayed on the shelves. You can imagine the situation internally was incredibly tense. When reporters started noticing the shortages and pressed Peter Main, Nintendo of America's vice president of marketing, on what they were doing to fix it, his response was famously blunt. He told the press they weren't doing much, quote, besides hoping and praying. Wow. That is a remarkably rare moment of vulnerability for a corporation that usually projected total dominance and a complete stranglehold over the entertainment industry. But wait, it gets messier. This drought didn't just affect Nintendo's in-house games. It created massive friction with their third-party partners. Back then, Nintendo strictly controlled the entire manufacturing process. A developer like Capcom or Konami couldn't just build their own cartridges. They had to pay Nintendo to do it. So because of the shortage, Nintendo had to tell these licensees they'd be getting significantly fewer cartridges than they actually ordered. Imagine spending a year and hundreds of thousands of dollars developing a game, only for Nintendo to say you can only have half the copies you need for Christmas. This absolutely infuriated developers. It actually triggered serious allegations of antitrust violations and price fixing. The whole thing grew so intense, fueled by angry letters from desperate parents and frustrated retailers, that politicians started stepping in, eventually sparking a massive investigation by the Federal Trade Commission into Nintendo's business practices. So the crucial point is, by the time the games actually hit the delivery trucks and headed to stores, analysts estimated the supply was about 15% lower than actual market demand. Now, 15% might not sound like a total wipeout on a spreadsheet, but out in the real world, in a market driven by intense childhood fads and hard holiday deadlines, it was more than enough to create an absolute Wild West down at the retail level. And as always, where there's desperation, there are people looking to exploit it. Some store owners saw these frantic parents searching for gifts and just completely capitalized on the drought. It wasn't uncommon at all to walk into a toy store and see a standard NES game, which usually retailed for around $40 or $50, marked all the way up to $70. Adjusted for inflation, that is a staggering amount of money for an 8-bit game. Consumers were paying luxury, price-gouged rates, basically just for the privilege of beating the empty shelves. The delay of the decade and changing marketing forever. Let's see how they pivoted. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because this pricing chaos and supply bottleneck forced Nintendo to drastically rethink their upcoming releases. Take Super Mario Bros. 3. The game was actually a massive, certified hit over in Japan in 1988, but Nintendo of America looked at the semiconductor drought and knew they couldn't possibly manufacture enough copies to meet US demand. So what did they do? They delayed it. They held the game back until early 1990. And during the entirety of 1989, instead of selling the game, they ran a massive hype campaign. They teased it relentlessly in Nintendo Power magazine and prominently featured it in the Hollywood movie The Wizard, literally using a feature-length film as a massive theatrical commercial for a video game that wasn't even out yet. They artificially stretched the anticipation to an absolute fever pitch while they waited for the semiconductor market to finally stabilize. And it worked. By the time the shortage eased in 1990, Super Mario Bros. 3 released to record-breaking sales, proving that while chips might have been scarce, the fans' appetite for games was infinite. But more importantly, this entire era served as a massive wake-up call for the industry. First, it proved once and for all that video games were no longer just a niche hobby. They were major players in the global electronics economy. Next, it highlighted the deep vulnerability of global supply chains, showing that even a giant like Nintendo was totally at the mercy of overseas manufacturing. And crucially, that delayed release of Mario 3 shifted video game marketing away from quick, seasonal pushes, creating the exact blueprint for the modern, year-long hype cycles we see today. It's honestly amazing how a shortage of memory chips for camcorders directly sparked FTC investigations and forever changed how our favorite media is sold. So I'll leave you with this. Do you remember the empty shelves of 1988? Or did your family ever have to pay $70 just to beat the holiday rush? It's a truly fascinating piece of economic history. Keep seeking out the stories behind the data, and I'll catch you next time.